Great. Good. So, aloha kakao. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. I am Jason Lewis. I'm a professor of design and computation arts at Concordia University in Montreal, who has the pleasure of currently living here on the North Shore so that I can collaborate with my colleagues here during my sabbatical. I'm also the nominated principal investigator for the Abundant Intelligences Research Partnership, and I'm very, very happy today to introduce our speaker and this lecture series. But first, just going to talk a little bit about what Abundant Intelligence is. It's an Indigenous-led, Indigenous-majority, international, and interdisciplinary team of experts coalesced into locally rooted research clusters or pods, like the Ka Hawaii Pai'aina pod here in Hawaii, to collaborate with Indigenous communities and learn from and with our knowledge holders to bring novel perspectives to transforming AI. It leverages an international network of Indigenous-centered research labs as our home bases and partners with world-class AI research organizations. And our goal is to advance methods for improving AI to better serve everybody through exploring and developing culturally grounded AI systems that support Indigenous ways of knowing. Or, in short, we're trying to figure out what Indigenous artificial intelligence might look like. So we have seeded about 30 research projects to date. We formally started in 2023. One of those is Abundant Soils. Today is the inaugural session in that project's lecture series. Mele, our speaker and the organizer of the lecture series, is currently a postdoctoral researcher at UH Manoa, working with Abundant Intelligences under the supervision of Dr. Susan Crow and myself. Mele has put together a remarkable group of speakers over the next few months to address the question of how we can approach the integration of Hawaiian and Western sciences using AI to better care for our Aina. We'll have speakers on ʻŌiwi governing systems, cosmology, knowledge systems, legal rights, data sovereignty, among other topics. And when we started thinking about abundant intelligences back in 2021, we started sort of doing the writing for the funding applications. These are exactly the kinds of conversations and explorations we hope to foster. So on behalf of Abundant Intelligences, I want to thank you, Mele, for the work that you've put in putting this all together for our enlightenment and our enjoyment. So now for the formal bio. Dr. Melemaikalani Moniz is a Kānaka ʻŌiwi legal scholar whose research explores the intersection between Western legal systems, environmental justice, and the rights of Indigenous peoples to propose decolonial changes to laws and policies while working towards liberation. Born and raised under the Malu of Ko'ola, Upako, on the windward side of Oahu, her family line comes from the Moko o Paewe, Na Hono o Pi'ilani, and Molo Kai Nui Ahina. Mele has a BA in English from Marist College, a JD from the Catholic University Columbus, an LLM in Environmental and Natural Resource Law from the University of Oregon, and a doctorate of juridical science in Indigenous people's law and policy from the University of Arizona. She's held a number of interesting positions related to law, policy, and Hawaiian culture. A small sample includes volunteering in the First Circuit Court of Hawaii and externing as a law clerk with the Family Law Unit of the Legal Aid Society of Hawaii, as well as the Hawaii Immigration Justice Center. After graduating with her JD, she clerked in the Second Circuit of Hawaii, served as a legislative aide to the senator representing Hilo, and held a teaching fellowship at the University of Arizona, teaching torts, contracts, and property law. Upon returning to Hawaii after obtaining her SJD, she worked as a trustee aide, probably trusted as well, but a trustee aide to the trustee representing Hawaii and Niihau at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. So on behalf of Abundant Intelligences, we welcome you, Mele, to take us away.
Mahalo nui, Jason. I really appreciate it. First and foremost, I do want to thank Jason and Susan. Both of them have been incredible. And I know that this conversation that we're starting and that we are hoping will drive meaningful, sustainable change in soil science for Indigenous peoples to create more opportunities for facilitating unity between our people will be a way for us to kind of steer this conversation forward. So I appreciate everybody and thank you so much for coming this morning. So to begin, I'm just going to share my screen. Sorry, we did this in practice. I have to. Can everybody see my screen?
It's still starting up. It's black on this end. There you go.
Okay, can you see it's in presentation mode, right?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. So, of course, my name is Mele, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. This is a new experience for me because I'm trained as a lawyer. Although I have an LLM in environmental law and natural resources, I am not a soil scientist. So I want to first and foremost say that. And so I really rely on Western soil scientists like Dr. Susan Crowe to be able to be a part of this conversation in a meaningful and equitable way. So first and foremost, I'm going to start with my papahana or the agenda. So I'm going to start with a question of contemplation that I'm hoping everybody will think about and think through as I go throughout my presentation. And then we'll discuss my positionality. And then I also have a mission statement that I created for Abundant Soils. I'll go into the background of the project and then the methodology in which I've constructed Abundant Soils, and then discuss the deliverables I've met in 2025 and this new open source classroom that I'm proposing for the next 8 months, as well as the targeted outcomes that I hope to gain from this open source classroom. And to begin, the question of contemplation that I want to ask everybody is, what does home mean to you? And if you're on Zoom, please feel free to drop it in the chat. It's important that I start with this question because I really want everybody to consider, what is it that makes home home? What does that truly mean to you? Dr. Apeli Hauofa, who's an oceanic scholar who is very well known, he talks about the concept of home, but from the Western perspective and indigenous perspectives. And in his discussion, he talks about how the Western perspective of home is often constructed in relationship to property value, something that could be disposed of sometime in the future, whereas an oceanic and indigenous perspective of home often meant a forever familial intergenerational relationship with the lands that we've been on since the beginning of time. This shows that for home, from a ʻŌiwi, from an indigenous, from a oceanic people's perspective, home truly is that relationship that we have to our land and the relationships that come with all of that within our natural world, and that is indivisible. And so this is my relationship with my aina. So aina, or home, my land, it's constructed of all of the people who also have their relationships with that aina as well. In our Kumulipo, which is the cosmogonic genealogical chant of creation that discusses where it is that ʻŌiwi come from, we come from Papahanao Moku, Earth Mother, and Sky Father Wakea, who come together, and their coupling results in the first taro plant. And then again, their coupling results in the first Kānaka ʻŌiwi. And so I start there to show that we all have a genealogical connection to our aina, which means every single person in this photo, right, in all of these photos are Native Hawaiian. Everybody, regardless of phenotype, has the Hawaiian blood, and that Hawaiian blood denotes that genealogical relationship that we all have with our aina. And so the mission statement that I decided to construct is a mission statement that's based on Dr. Teresia Teaiva. She talks about using this olelo no'eau at the very beginning to talk about how can we invite people into a space to learn about indigeneity. How do we construct a place where we're able to actually have equity when we're looking at it from many, many different perspectives, but coming from inviting people into a space to be able to look at us face to face to learn about who we are. And so the purpose of Abundant Soils truly is to facilitate aina momona. And momona, oftentimes people read that as fat, but truly it could be read in this instance as abundance, right? We want to facilitate abundance for our aina, not just because that abundance affects us, but because our aina truly is our mother and we have that genealogical connection and relationship. And so I've decided to break Abundant Soils into 7 different aspects. And I begin here because I'm going to talk about this all in depth a little bit further, but I begin here because I would like this to be an opportunity to start thinking about what would a decolonial and anti-racist environment look like when we're trying to ethically integrate different knowledge systems together, especially with Indigenous knowledge systems. Because of the epistemic dominance of subjugating systems, we're put into a position where we do have to think about what would an ethical integration look like when one knowledge system, like Native Hawaiian knowledges, are going to become subjugated by Western soil science or Western knowledge systems. And how could we use that understanding and that knowing to be able to actually facilitate a true ethical integration? And so this is my methodology. So of course, we're in academia, right? So I'm writing papers, but I'm also having presentations and discussions that I'm hoping will create more opportunities for us to have conversations about what it actually means to create, especially within this political climate, truly decolonial and actively anti-racist education. And from a space where Indigenous educators are at the core of all of this, who are leading and pushing the conversation and able to be seen not as merely resources to be mined, but actually as truly people who have a worthwhile contribution, because our Indigenous knowledges truly are going to be the answer that the world needs at this time, especially when we're talking about climate justice. And so we're also creating an Abundant Soils Project website. So every presentation that's going to be done going forward will go on this website. So at some time in the future, if there's any opportunities for Native Hawaiians or other Western soil scientists or just anyone who wants to learn about this, they can become a part of the process and hear and understand and learn from all of the Native Hawaiians who are going to speak about abundant soils. We also are going to create social media. And then what I'm most excited to talk about is the open source classroom. And I begin with the open source classroom for abundant soils because we have to be able to first lay a foundation to be able to have discussions of what all of these intersections look like. And so when we have the actual foundation, then I'm hoping that we'll be able to get to a space where we're able to kind of conceptualize what an Indigenous perspective is, but also see how there's an equitable integration that can come from this. And then I do want to create an abundant soils workshop called We Are Oceania. And I would like to do this in August, where we can look at all of the different ways that oceanic knowledges intersect with Western soil sciences, as well as artificial intelligence. And so these are the deliverables met. So of course, I've been working on a lot of papers, but I've also been presenting at conferences. And meaningfully at the AGM, our AGM that was in October, I was able to moderate a panel, and these incredible Native scholars were talking about all of the interesting work that they're doing to create more technological sovereignty for their people at different levels. I also presented at the Critical Race Symposium and had discussions in different invited lectures at the University of Hawaii at Manoa to show what it is that we're working on of how do we create artificial intelligence based on a decolonial framework. I'm also working with the Shear Lab, and we're doing data governance, but from an ʻŌiwi perspective. I know there are a lot of conversations about what does data sovereignty and data governance look like, and that is very meaningful and helpful in the way in which we're constructing that. But it's really important that anything on Hawaiian land affecting Native Hawaiians is coming from a Hawaiian cultural worldview. And so how is it that we should be able to integrate that kind of perspective into our data governance policy? So for example, and I briefly talk about this in my 5 minutes with Mele that Sabrina shared, but going into a lab space, first and foremost, every researcher should understand what our connection is to our land. When I came into the Shear Lab, I did a lot of research, and I had a lot of conversations with researchers about how much do they know about Hawaiian knowledge. Almost no one, right, had an understanding of the actual relationship that we had to our Aina. And so asking the question of what does soil mean from a Hawaiian perspective? It's hard if people have no idea of what a Hawaiian perspective is to be able to answer that question. And so it was important for me that we come from this understanding of that cultural relationship to then shape the way that people should be having their relationship with soil as they go through the process of all different types of lab testing. And then, of course, that should also inform who has access to the data that's derived from all of that soil, how long are they able to keep that data, who should be able to give them permission, but also what does informed consent look like? and all of the different steps of actually getting the soil, keeping the soil, and then let's say you're returning the soil. I hope everybody does that, right? Who actually has informed consent? What does that look like? And what would that mean? And all of these different aspects of this overall process. And then also having conversations about the data use agreements, because I think it's been something that's challenging this Indigenous data sovereignty of how do we give agency to Indigenous peoples in a space where we're largely kept out of. And so what does a data use agreement look like, but coming through the lens of equity for actual Native Hawaiians? And so this has just been an ongoing conversation and something that we're talking about, and hopefully the more that we're able to have these conversations, the more opportunities we have to promote equity in this space. And then we've also had past Abundant Soils meetings where we've had conversations with other people in Hawaii about what does it mean to create abundant soils, what should it look like, but also what is that connection to Aina? What is our spiritual and psychic connection that we have with our land, and how should that inform the way in which Western soil science is constructed and applied? And so this is my open source classroom. And so I'm going to start with the first component. So every month, there's going to be at least 4 lectures where we go into in depth all of these different components. And so, for example, ʻŌiwi foundational knowledge. Everybody should know at least the kumalipo, at the very, very least, right? Before you go into an actual lab and start experimenting on our kupuna. That should be foundational knowledge. It's also important that everybody understands what is ʻŌiwi epistemology. I think oftentimes we talk about Native Hawaiian culture, perspective, epistemology, and a lot of people do not understand necessarily what that means, or even the extent of that, the depth of what it is that we're referring to, because as Dr. Manu Meyer discusses, epistemology is a poor word to be able to translate Hawaiian essence, Hawaiian being, Hawaiian knowledges. And so coming into this space of being a part of Abundant Soils, I want everybody to have the opportunity to really share in the richness and understanding of what we mean when we're talking about Hawaiian epistemology. And then in March, one of the components that we'll be discussing is developing an understanding of oppression for racialized peoples. It's important that everybody have a perspective on what does oppression actually mean and how does that apply to the different peoples, right, that are being affected and impacted by colonization. So for example, understanding oppression for Native Hawaiians, it might be similar to Native peoples on the continent. However, there are differences, just like there are differences between Hawaiians and the Maori people, although we share that same genealogical connection. And then in April, I want to talk about advancing digital sovereignty. Digital sovereignty, I didn't really know much about it before our meeting in October, the AGM. Dr. Kevin Shedlock, and I'll talk about this further, he brought it up and mentioned that I should really be thinking about everything through this lens of perspective. I think he's absolutely brilliant, and I really do want to start advancing these types of conversations in Hawaii. And then in May, of course, we're going to discuss Western soil science, because we also need a foundational understanding of Western soil science to be able to start talking about integration. I think there's often an assumption, especially because I'm in natural resources and environmental management at UH, that everybody who comes will know Western soil science, but that's not an assumption to be made here. I would really like to create a space where we can go into depth and talk about Western soil science and give it deference, but at the same time, it's just going to be a small part of the overarching conversation, which is how do we ethically integrate anything with Native Hawaiian knowledge? And then next, after that, we're going to talk about that intersection between Native Hawaiians and Western soil science, and then go into talking about this intersection with artificial intelligence added to it. And then lastly, of course, in August, I would really like to have this workshop on looking at oceanic peoples and our intersection with Western soil science and artificial intelligence. And so I wanted to go through every component to kind of explain the way in which I've constructed everything. I think this is important because oftentimes when we're having these conversations, if people don't understand why it is that we do what we're doing, they're not going to be invested or as meaningfully invested in hopefully the outcome, which is to create more equity for Native Hawaiians. And so I'm starting with this first cultural foundation with ʻŌiwi knowledge holders, because looking at the impacts of imperialism through the means of colonization, it's important to see how that connects to the epistemic extraction that happens in academia. So, for example, talking about all of the instances in which soil is tested, right? Never mind, like, regardless of whether or not there's informed consent, there has to be this understanding of that connection between the theft of our land, its commodification and exploitation, and understanding how that intrinsically relates back to our colonization, right? And it's important that we have these conversations as well, because in order to be able to effectively organize against our oppression, to create more space for liberation, we have to understand what's actually happening to us and what our oppression looks like to be able to start having conversations, and from a Hawaiian perspective, for ea, or sovereignty. And so Dr. Trask, when she's talking about how to actively combat imperialism and colonization, suggests decolonization. And through decolonization, which is truly, it is a resistance to colonization, but it's also the cultural assertions that help us to actively combat the ongoing indoctrination that we face every single day. And so if we're able to get to a space to start shifting our mindset, and then we're able to start seeing from not just a Native Hawaiian perspective, but also we begin to understand the oppression of racialized peoples around the world. And it's important to me that as we start to make these shifts, that we have this perspective of decolonial theory to encourage us to be able to have more opportunities to see where this oppression exists and what that looks like. So, for example, if you don't understand the connection that Native Hawaiians have to soil, if you don't understand that our bones get planted into the aina to then become soil, if we don't understand about that kumalipo cosmogonic genealogical relationship that we have as from the aina, right, with our aina, then you wouldn't understand the meaning of what soil means to be able to adequately understand what our oppression means in this instance. Right? There's the extraction of that soil is akin to the extraction of the bones of our ancestors. It goes hand in hand because, as soil scientists have explained to me, our bones become the organic matter that creates soil. And so being able to have that understanding is the first step in being able to conceptualize what does oppression look like for racialized peoples, and namely for Native Hawaiians. It's also important that we center Hawaiians when on Hawaiian lands. This is important from not just a place-based perspective, but also concerning intersectionality, because the more that we center the most marginalized in our society, the more it impacts our collective liberation. And centering Indigenous peoples on their lands and territories actually creates more space and capacity for other people to be able to show up and to be part of the conversation. I also think it's really important that especially in academic spaces, everybody understands the white possessive. There's this opportunity, I think, in having these conversations for people to see all the different perspectives that Indigenous peoples have coming into these spaces. Because I think oftentimes, because there's an unequal power dynamic at play, many times Indigenous perspectives are left out of the conversation. And so understanding what the effect is of the white possessive, of the oppressors and the group of colonizers who actively have this possessive approach that they may not be able to particularly see due to their privilege, and how that affects everybody in the room and how that actually has systemic implications. It's also important that when we're talking about oceanic peoples, that everybody has some type of historical, but also present-day understanding of Asian imperialism across Oceania. And that includes all of its effects, like the military and the sex trade, where Native Hawaiian women, girls, and queer people are being actively trafficked. This also goes hand in hand with advancing digital sovereignty. It is important that when we're having conversations about data, that everybody understand what data should mean or ought to mean from a Hawaiian perspective. And so understanding that our kumalipo, which is that we all are birthed, right, from this coupling of Sky Father and Earth Mother, results in the first Kānaka ʻŌiwi. That means everything within our spiritual universe, our lands, our waters, the heavens, every single aspect of what creates our natural world has to be considered as part of our data, right? So just because just because of the Western construct of property ownership applies in one particular instance does not negate the indigenous connection that we have to our aina, and that should not negate our capacity to have informed consent about the data and to be able to give permission or not in the collection of that data. And so this also goes hand in hand with the way that we're conceiving of data sovereignty. So for example, in the project that I'm in now at the University of Hawaii, all of the data that's being kept is not being kept by me, right? All of that data is being kept at the university. And so what happens if there's a breach at the university? What happens if all of the different people have access to that who are not Hawaiian, who didn't get the informed consent of Hawaiians, right, to have this data and information? What if they share that data with people? And what happens when the settler state in Hawaii, for example, takes all of that information and uses it for their own gain? Right. So it puts us in a position of wanting to be able to have autonomy, agency over our actual data and to be able to control it. And so this is why I found it really interesting when Dr. Kevin Shedlog was talking about how is it that we can advance digital sovereignty? Because it's not enough that I just have the data and information, right? What I also need is the capacity to protect it, have my own servers, to truly be able to have true technological sovereignty over not just our data, but the infrastructure, right, that holds it. All of the different information that makes up that should be within my purview. And so this also does translate to Western soil science when a lot of the information that scientists are looking for, or mainly, is data. And so what does that look like within this context? And so first and foremost, I think it's important that everybody understand what does Western mean in this context. I use Stuart Hall to be able to explain the way in which power and knowledge is conveyed from this Western perspective and how Western is actually more of a historical process as opposed to an actual just term that we're used to calling Europe. And this Western concept actually goes hand in hand with the creation of what we know of as soil science, looking into the different definitions that we have and reading through the different perspectives within soil science of what does it actually mean. Usually and oftentimes it talks about soil as part of a larger and greater ecosystem, but it's also important to understand that for us, right, from a Native Hawaiian perspective, soil is so much more, there's so much more dimension to it. There's so much more than just it being a part of the environment or a part of an ecosystem. It goes much deeper because it has that familial connection that we hold with all of our ancestors. And so looking at that actual intersection, I think it's important first and foremost that we have the capacity to articulate what our relationship is to soil. And so understanding from just looking at our cosmology, understanding the kumulipo, we can utilize that to have conversations of what is our relationship to soil, to talk about this as our cultural property. I use property as a legal term of art, but not because I think our kupuna are actually property. But if we come from this perspective, right, it gives us more capacity to be able to exercise our self-determinations. And then this then helps us to be able to use our epistemologies, use our cosmology to be able to inform and expand upon Western soil science so that we can actually advance environmental justice. There's also an aspect of understanding dignity. And I know like Paulo Freire talks a lot about how do we have this humanizing perspective by the oppressors of us, the oppressed. And that, although I don't like the term humanistic because humanization, because it really centers the human when we know that there's so much breadth and depth of life that comes from our aina and all within our natural world. But I do think it's important to talk about because it does go hand in hand with our being perceived as actually human beings. And so being able to have dignity, to be able to have conversations about soil as our kupuna, and knowing that one day our ʻiwi, our bones, will become a part of the soil, and that too could be mined by scientists in the future. And what does that look like, and how does that affect us? That really does open the door to start bringing our dignity into the conversation. I think we also need to be talking about how it is that we can repatriate soil. We've been having conversations at UH of what does that look like. And I so appreciate Dr. Susan Crow having these conversations with me and just holding space for me of how do I work this out, of how do we even accomplish this, and what does this look like? Because the next step is always what is the protocol that should be in place? What are the different things that Native Hawaiians should be teaching us to be able to get to a place to actually take soil in a way that's pono, that's righteous or just? But it gets very difficult when we're talking about how to create protocol for a space that's almost exclusively non-Indigenous. What does that look like? How do you make it so that it's not performative? How do you make it so that we're actually promoting equity and not giving settlers in our society the opportunity to be able to use that information, weaponize it against us, to say that we've done X, Y, and Z, so of course we can take soil from here, right? Understanding all of these different layered connections and relationships we have with our land, we have to be able to come from a space of having a genuine conversation of what will that look like in the future of taking soil from the land? What can we do in the process of the testing of soil? And then what does the actual return look like in a way that's actually equitable to us and soil as our kupuna? And that's a very difficult conversation to have. And so the next step is then understanding what informed consent actually is, and knowing that because we're conceiving of data from this very broad perspective based on our cosmology, it's important that everybody understand, including the people who are non-Indigenous, they understand that the reason that that definition is constructed so broadly is because it gives us more opportunities for liberation to create that dignity for ourselves and for our ancestors. And then also, I hope this is an opportunity for us to have more conversations about what does it mean to mitigate the white possessive and start looking at Indigenous peoples, our natural world, not as objects or resources, but as, people who actually have something valuable and meaningful to contribute that could lead to everyone's liberation. And I know that Cesar talks about the thingification of colonized peoples from a civilized versus uncivilized perspective. Also, Freire talks about this seeing us as objects as opposed to people in order to advance conversations of liberation as actual humanization. And so, what I want more than anything is for us to be able to have a conversation understanding us from this human perspective. And then to then step into how do we put AI into all of this? It's already difficult because AI is in a space where, we know through abundant intelligences that the epistemic dominance of these subjugating systems is actively working to the marginalization of Indigenous knowledge systems. And so how can we then approach Native Hawaiian ethical integration of our culture with Western soil science, which is already difficult to do, but in addition to artificial intelligence? And so I think it's important that we have conversations where we talk about, first as a community or as Native Hawaiians, as a lahui or nation, how is it that we should approach artificial intelligence? What does that look like for us? And what does that mean to us first? Before we get to this next step of, okay, so what should we be doing to minimize cognitive imperialism? What can we be doing to minimize harm? In many ways, creating community-driven technologies with abundant intelligences that is mitigating the harm to us through cognitive imperialism. However, it's not the only solution, right? So we have to be in conversation with our communities to have very frank and informational meetings about what does it actually mean to give our knowledge and information to artificial intelligence. What does that mean from a data perspective? What does that mean from a cognitive imperialism perspective? And how can we say it in a way where we're actively trying to facilitate unity amongst ourselves and the people who have a history of extracting knowledge and information from us and to our exclusion? And then I also think that talking about how can Indigenous knowledge systems, how can Native Hawaiian knowledge actually work to transform Western soil science and AI for the betterment of everyone. From an interest convergence perspective, I think that's helpful in moving the conversation forward of what is it that the world ought to look like, right? What future is it that we're trying to construct? And how does that actually equate to liberation for all? And so the last component that I have is consistent community engagement. I think there are often critiques of this that can come of everybody, Indigenous peoples should be able to create space for non-Indigenous people to come into that space and be just a part of everything. And I very much so hesitate at that. That truly is colonization, right? Creating space and them coming in does not change the outcome. And so, how can we have conversations about power dynamics still existing? Because even if we're in an exclusively indigenous or a predominantly indigenous space, those power dynamics really do exist and continue to exist and continue to work to our oppression as opposed to our liberation, even if we're in a space with indigenous peoples. And so, what does that look like in conversation? How can we have these conversations with our non-Indigenous colleagues to facilitate unity amongst us, right? These are hard conversations. They are not easy conversations to be had, but they are conversations that need to be a part of abundant soils because we're trying to ethically integrate Indigenous knowledge system with Western soil science and artificial intelligence. And then having more conversations about the white possessive and what does that mean? What does that look like? And how does that affect collaboration and co-production? I think even Freire talks about how the perspective of the oppressor is often from like a paternalistic perspective of humanitarianism. And so I'm just going to do this very nice thing for you. And you'll be thankful to me because oppressors need the oppressed in order to continue to be oppressors, right? And so, what does that look like, and how does that kind of translate into university spaces, which Freire talks about? Well, also, how does that affect truly creating an equitable space of collaboration and co-production? And then, of course, Maori scholar Brad Coombs, he talks about the falsely inclusive politics of co-management. In that particular case, he was referring to legal personhood and talking about what does that look like for Indigenous peoples trying to facilitate more equity for themselves and for their lands for environmental justice purposes. But it speaks to a larger issue, right? Of oftentimes we create these commissions or committees where it's a mix of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and the result isn't that the Indigenous peoples have the opportunity to speak and say what it is that they need to say, right? Oftentimes the result is that non-Indigenous people are nice up to a point, and then it changes. Right, you're nice up to a point so that it makes you look like you are nice and helpful. But then the actual change that could lead to systemic change, right, that doesn't actually end up moving forward. And so how do we actually have these conversations of what does that look like? How does that affect our projects? How does that affect Indigenous people in academia? Because hopefully the more that we have these conversations, the more opportunities we have to actively combat it. And so these are my targeted outcomes. My hope is that I create an opportunity for non-Native peoples to be able to develop their anti-racism. I think it is important that everybody is working towards being actively anti-racist for people who've been colonized, right? Everybody should be actively decolonizing, or at least given the opportunity. And I think it's very hard in this space in academia, even just being in Hawaii, to understand what does that mean or what does that look like. And luckily, there's so many ʻŌiwi scholars who've come before us who've talked about this and who give us different perspectives of decolonizing and what that could mean for us, not just on an individual level, but from a nation level. And then my hope is that researchers who come into the soil science lab in the future, they have the ability to articulate the interconnectedness that we have with our aina. I know that there's so many people who want to do a good job and are well-meaning, and I'm hoping that this is an opportunity for them to be able to understand what it means to actually help us, right, in this space. And just knowing our cosmology first and foremost, that in and of itself will be helpful, right? And I encourage everybody to learn about the different cosmologies of the Indigenous peoples of the land that they're on right now, right? Even where their university is, because just starting that process of opening yourself up to all these different levels of understanding of who we are as people, but also who we are from this like larger spiritual universe perspective, I think will help create more equity for all of us. And so I do want to encourage more critical reflections to hopefully inspire true action of solidarity for Indigenous sovereignty. And that's our goal, right? Liberation from an Indigenous people's perspective, right, is truly liberation grounded on our own constructions of liberation or sovereignty. And so, from a Hawaiian perspective, I want to encourage everybody to think more critically, to inspire true action to achieve ea for us and for our descendants, but also for themselves. And then I would like this to also be an opportunity for everybody to start having conversations about what does it look like to develop an actual framework for decolonial anti-racist education. So for example, there's so many conversations about how do we teach Indigenous data sovereignty? And truly the question is not how do we teach it per se, but how do we make people who are not Indigenous care? That's a very, very hard question to answer because we can't make anybody care. However, in this space, I'm trying to create the opportunity for people to understand why they should care or ought to care, but also to just see us more as humans, as people who have a meaningful contribution. Because the more that we're able to be in a space to truly facilitate pilina or build relationships, my hope is that that will be an opportunity for us to actually all be working towards this goal of ea for ourselves and each other. And so, of course, I do want to end with that question of what does home mean to you? Because I'm sure for the Indigenous peoples of their land that they're on, and if you're Indigenous, you know the answer to this question, right? My home is the place where the ʻiwi of my ancestors, the thousands of my ancestors who've come before me since the beginning of time, who've died here on this aina, whose ʻiwi have become the soil, that is my home. That's what I'm connected to at just one level. It's also the place where your ewe or the placenta from your birth, we bury it in the aina, right? It's also that way of connecting us to place. It's a place where our ewe is to become then part of that land. And then also too, there's that third aspect of it, of understanding aina as our mother, as understanding aina as Papa Hanau Moku, as a reiteration of the goddess Haumea, and understanding all of these different facets of her personification in nature and how that connects to ourselves. And so in many ways, the ʻiwi of my ancestors that's buried here since the beginning of time, that ʻiwi is what makes this my home. And so I also want to know that it's important that when we're talking about ʻiwi, right, thousands of years since the beginning of time, it's also important to consider the effect on Indigenous peoples who are forced from their lands and forced because of, in Hawaii, for example, because so many people have moved here. And so understanding the effect of diaspora, of this is still their home, right? This is their home because the ʻiwi of their kupuna have been here since the beginning of time. Thousands of their ancestors have died, right, to be able to create the soil that we talk about here and now. And so home means to us this forever, and it's not changing, right? It's unchangeable. We are indivisible from our land, from our gods, and from our people. And so thank you. That is the end of my talk. My home.
Woo! That is so cool. Wow.
Pedera.
Thank you so much, Mele. That was awesome. Just for everyone in the chat, just to streamline things, we're gonna try this Q&A period as set up. Like, if you have any questions, just type them in the chat, and then from our end, we'll read them out to Mele and get some discussion going like that. So yeah, feel free to pose anything.
It's okay to ask hard questions.
Just articulating it.
I don't so much have a question, but I'm glad I came to this today because I heard your work and the importance of your work. But I also, as a postdoc student, found the structure today of my own work. So thank you for sharing that structure, but more importantly, thank you for sharing the story of what your ancestors, our ancestors, have, the legacy that they've had for us to stand, for you to stand on your positionality and share today. So, yeah, wrapped. Thanks, Melly.
Thank you.
So I put a question in the chat, but I can just say it, which is sort of interested in the last part about not being able to make people care, but showing them why they should care. And just wondering if you wanted to expand on that a little more.
Oh, thank you so much, Jason. I know there's a lot of critiques about creating space for non-Indigenous peoples to come and learn about Indigenous knowledges. And I do think that that's an important critique to have, especially in this instance. And I'm open to critique because I think that's valuable information for me to actually create meaningful change for our people. And so this opportunity that I'm presenting, my hope is that this is going to be different because this is Indigenous led. I'm Indigenous. But also this is going to be all of these different Native Hawaiian scholars who have agreed to be able to contribute something, knowing that although in this present modern day, there could be no change that comes, right? Soil scientists and many of them already have, right, been very irritated and annoyed of me having this conversation. But that does not mean that the conversation ends with me or it ends in my lifetime even. And so how do I create more foundation for other Native Hawaiians who come after me to be able to use these lectures, use this lecture series to be able to say, hey, I'm making assertions of returning the soil that you've taken for your data and research. I'm asking for you to give back the data and information that you've taken from our land and Aina. And so instead of them just saying that on their own and being in a space of largely non-Indigenous peoples, right? Hopefully this lecture series, they'll be able to point to that and use that to their leverage to be able to advance conversations about what does equity look like in this academic, very white dominant space.
Mahalo.
We had another one from Brian Kawada, who, Brian, if you want to unmute after this as well and expand on it, feel free. But Brian says, you spoke about giving agency to the Kānaka ʻŌiwi people, but can you also talk about how your project gives agency to the Aina? How are you formalizing, being receptive, and listening to the Aina?
Yes, so, and having conversations about what does Aina mean, especially from an ʻŌiwi perspective, a lot of times I've kind of run into people who construct of or believe Aina to be very like the wilderness perspective of we go into the wilderness and we commune with Aina by just like being outside and being outside in that space. Whereas that is an aspect of it, but it's a very, very small aspect, right? Our ability to be part of our Aina, to have this kinship, connection, and relationship means that Aina is an actual consciousness. Like when we say that Aina is Papa Hanau Moku, it truly is an actual person, right? Papa Hanau Moku, and although she has different iterations and different forms and different personifications in nature, that doesn't detract from the fact that she truly is, you know, a person. And I don't like to relegate her to just being a human, but to give, you know, context and conversation of Papa Hanau Moku actually having agency, thoughts, perspectives, really important and intrinsic value and wisdom to give to us. We have to be able to go and talk to our Aina. And so I did do a Aina Connection workshop where I invited scientists into a space to start learning how to connect to Aina and having the meditation of understanding that when I say that Aina is a consciousness, I want them to experience that and to understand when I say a consciousness, I truly mean that it's a consciousness that responds back, that talks to us and should be informing our decisions. And so I'm hoping that in having these conversations in this particular space, it will encourage and create more opportunities for people to see us and our relationships as having value and agency, just because they're not just land as an object, and not just because soil is just something to be utilized and gained through just the data that it can provide, but as our actual ancestor and kupuna.
Thanks. Thanks, Melee. And yeah, Brian, if you wanted to discuss that further at all, feel free. And also, folks, during this period, if folks want to turn their cameras on, like, please feel free for, just a little bit of more of a discussion vibe. But yeah, unless, Brian, you had anything you wanted to add, I think we have Petra up next with a question.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Melee. I suppose it's coming from our relationship within the Pacific. Um, what do you need? I suppose it's an imaginary and forwarding your work, but as a collaborator here in Aotearoa, what are maybe two or three things that we can support the project that you have to survive? So yeah, just reaching out in regards to the collaboration for imagining the next steps within in the work that you're doing.
Yes, my hope is I've created a tentative schedule, and I had a meeting with Hemi and with Kevin to talk about how the Aotearoa pod can contribute. And so I know that I've proposed, them being part of the conversation, of all of you being part of the conversation of creating digital sovereignty. But I also want to create a space where different oceanic peoples, Maori people, Aboriginal people, can be able to start giving their perspective of what does soil actually mean to them, and talking about their relationship with their land in Aina. Because even me just saying it and even pointing to other Hawaiians, I don't think is as meaningful as people understanding us as not just Native Hawaiians or Polynesians, but as oceanic peoples where our kinship connections have existed since the beginning of time, not just with our particular Aina, but with Aina across the Pacific. And so, how can we have a broadened perspective of that to understand a deeper perspective of all of our relationships and the kinship relationships that truly should inform the way that all of us are conceptualizing of soil, even just on our own Aina.
Awesome. And we have another one from Jason.
It's actually from me, Skawanati. Hi, Mele.
Oh,
Nice to see you and great to hear you. Really, I wish I could. I want to talk with you about so many things, and
yes.
I'm not sure where to start. But I think I'll start with talking about sharing our values and our protocols with non-native people. So for those who don't know me, I am Skawanati is my name, and I'm Ganyange Haga from the northeastern part of North America. That's indigenous from northeastern part of North America. And so we have, I feel, so many similarities with Native Hawaiian people. Like, our Thanksgiving address to me is like your, you said it earlier, I know it's like your chant. Yes.
Yeah, the Kumulipo.
The Kumulipo, and our connections to the land, our historical and traditional and ancient connections to the soil and the land beneath it and Mother Earth. And we also think about peacekeeping. We have lots of protocols about how to keep the peace amongst the people. We have and my feeling in my work is to spread that information to all people, because it was some great thoughts, it was some great ways of conducting society. But there are a lot of people amongst my people that don't want to share that knowledge. I think a big part of it is that we don't feel secure in our own knowledge yet. I think we're moving towards that point where we will be. But I wanted to ask you how you felt about it in your situation, and because you seem very ready, and I think that's awesome.
Yeah, I think that's valid, because that is something I think about a lot. And this whole process of even just getting to this step of sharing this with the entire Abundant Intelligences network is very daunting and uncomfortable, because I have made and I continue to make critiques of myself of even putting us in this position to begin with. And so I feel deeply uncomfortable sharing, especially because I know, as all of you know intimately, that this is often used against us to prevent us from having any sort of self-determination. And so this is really daunting. I'm thinking that most people just kind of are going to ignore this, truly. And I think it truly speaks to I know this is annoying to soil scientists to even be part of this conversation at this time. And this is a relatively safe space where I can talk about it and set up a lecture series where other Native people, not just me, right, can come into the space and give their contribution and then leave. And it's important that I create space for them to leave, because when you're in a space where you have to actively contribute or your livelihood is dependent upon it, you're forced to make a lot of concessions that put you in a position of not being able to kind of to show up in your full self, to be able to advocate and advance liberation for your people in a way that you would like. And so I'm hoping that having other Native peoples come into this space, give their contribution, and hopefully have more conversations about what they've shared will actually create more opportunity for Western soil scientists to maybe just be a little bit more open. And I do not propose that that will happen, right? It's highly probable that it will not, right? It's highly probable that there could be no meaningful change that comes from this. However, my hope is that just creating this will be an opportunity for Kānaka ʻŌiwi in the future to use it to advance whatever their case is for liberation for our people.
Yeah, well, mahalo.
Thank you, Mele. We've got one more question from Daniel Spach, or Spack, sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But after this, if there's anyone who wants to ask any final questions, we probably have time for just a couple more here. But anyway, Daniel says, most AI is currently trained on language and data with the colonial paradigm innately embedded in the orientation. Is there any effort to train AI specifically to the languages that hold an inherently interconnected orientation to the land, to configure the intelligence to the indigenous cultural perspectives for those cultures in their interactions with emerging intelligences?
Yes, thank you for that question, because now it gives me an opportunity to talk about abundant intelligences a little bit. So, of course, when we're having conversations about cognitive imperialism and the effect on indigenous peoples, we know that the epistemic dominance of these subjugating systems work to our marginalization and exclusion. Actually, Professor Jason Lewis and Dr. Hemi Funga and I think Dr. Cheda Yolgomirez, they have a paper on this that talks about how abundant intelligences is actively combating this. And so for us, having conversations about what does a decolonial framework look like for artificial intelligence is having conversations truly about how to take different AI ecosystems, right, to be able to construct AI that's conceptualized, developed, designed, and then deployed from an indigenous perspective that's actually community driven, that is created, right, by ourselves, by people as part of our community, to be able to actively combat this cognitive imperialism and epistemic dominance. There's also part of the conversation, I think, of what is community-driven technologies goes hand in hand with this larger understanding of us just being alive and living, right? It has that connection to the people that inform, the way that we conceive of the world. So being part of our families, being part of different people in our lahui gives us the opportunity to understand what it is that our people actually need, right? And what they want, as opposed to something like ChatGPT, which is just imposed on us. And so like truly creating community-driven technologies is with that concern in mind for my aunties and for my cousins and for my parents and my grandparents. It's understanding how our kinship connectionships work to inform the way that we're conceiving of artificial intelligence and developing it, deploying it, and then protecting our data. I know I don't want to go on and on, but it's really important to think about it from through the lens of what Te Hiku Media is, how they're thinking about it, because Keone Mahilona made a comment that I thought was so insightful. He was saying that, you know, they knew what sovereignty was for them. And so the way that they set up Te Hiku was to ensure that they had sovereignty over all aspects of their project, which results in this present day, not them understanding, right, of what would become of these large corporations who are mining our data, but knowing now, right, what has now transpired, they were protected because they knew what they believed, right? Like they had an actual understanding of sovereignty, so much so that they could protect themselves in the future, even though they didn't know what it was that was coming. And I found that very powerful. And so that also goes hand in hand with why it's important to me that we talk about how to advance digital sovereignty for Native Hawaiians, because we don't have sovereign land in the same way that First Nations do, or people, Native Americans on the continent, and Maori people in Aotearoa. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, but I hope it answered your question.
Awesome. Didn't look like I got any other questions while Melee was answering that. So I think, Melee, if there's anything you want to say as a closing remarks to wrap up our session, then we can be all done for now.
Thank you, everybody, for coming. I really do appreciate it. If you have any comments or feedback, or if you want to have more conversations about what it is that I'm trying to create for Abundant Soils, please let me know. Please reach out to me, because I really do want this to be an active conversation where things can change and develop and evolve and grow as we go. So please don't hesitate to reach out.